2022 was a year of a lot of big game releases, a lot of which I didn't play. I did play a lot of older games new to me that caught my attention in one way or another, so I thought I'd compile which games I thought were the best of what I first experienced in 2022, whether they came out this year or not. I realize this list isn't really relatable as no one else played the exact same games I played in 2022, but think of this more as my recommendation for 10 games I recently discovered, of varying genres and obscurity, that I enjoyed the most. And hey, if I convince just a few people to try something out, I consider my job a success. Link's Awakening is about as faithful as a remake can get. Every single tile in the original game was respected and left intact, and then polished up with its gorgeous new art style. It's not hard to tell this is a remake of an old game based on the grid-like layout of everything, and the relatively small overworld compared to other top-down Zelda games. There's definitely something to say about the value of taking more creative liberty to reimagine original design when remaking a game, but it's hard to debate that this is easily the cleanest way to play Link's Awakening to date. Not having to equip a sword and shield in an item slot from the menu every time is genuinely what next-gen gaming is all about. The small overworld is made up for by the sheer memorability of its inhabitants, where interactions are downright whimsical at times. Everything takes place outside of Hyrule on the island of Koholint, and it's a surprisingly fresh experience to see so many new faces, where the dreamy soundtrack really captures how unfamiliar yet cozy this island is. It reminded me of Majora's Mask with how surreal and unique it felt to make up for technical limitations, similar to Majora's Mask compensating for short development time, except it was way more of a whimsical kind of surreal as opposed to being depressing and creepy. The gameplay here is pretty basic as far as Zelda is concerned, but it's got some solid dungeons and fun world traversal to keep things enjoyable throughout its runtime, and never really dips in quality. A lot of these are definitely merits carried over from the original game, but it's nice to finally be able to fully appreciate them in a much more polished and better paced game. Splatoon 3 is probably the toughest sell on this list if you aren't already a fan of Splatoon. It's the same style of gameplay we're all used to in the previous games, along with new weapons and specials, as well as some game mode tweaks that make the game feel just a bit more comfortable to play. That and most of the content will be periodically released throughout the coming years, as is tradition with this series. That said, Splatoon games are already tight packages on launch, and 3 only improves on that of previous entries, so future content isn't so much a way to fill the hole left in an incomplete game, as it is incentive to come back to the game and continue experiencing an ever-evolving multiplayer, such as the cycle of Splatoon hype. But that isn't to sell short what this game already has available. New weapons and specials are just as creative as they've always been, with specials feeling punchy yet never too overpowered, and the weapons offering interesting new ways to cover turf. I especially appreciate the nod to the Rivers of Blood samurai sword, which can kill people in one hit. The campaign is also easily the best in the series, with a zany style, characters, and lore, as is familiar to the series, and some of the more interesting challenge-style objectives lifted from Splatoon 2's Octo expansion, rather than just getting to the end of the level every time. And then they have Big Man, which is probably in the top 3 biggest stingrays of all time. Splatoon 3 may play it relatively safe at the end of the day, as it doesn't shake up the formula too drastically, but hell if it isn't a fun time. In 2020, I made this terrible mistake of playing Genshin Impact. The worst part is that I kind of enjoyed it, but it doesn't matter, Uncle Ben. Fortnite Honkai Impact 3rd is better. Honkai Impact 3rd is the Devil May Cry Dante edition of video games, whereas Genshin's main draw was the open world and... guys, this isn't Breath of the Wild. Honkai focuses on creating a tight, linear, streamlined experience that really hones in on the combat. The enemy variety isn't quite what it could be, though the different Valkyries have such fun and diverse movesets and playstyles that this admittedly doesn't bother me as much as it usually would. That, and I genuinely think it's almost worth playing for the story alone. Not to spoil anything specific, but the story goes from casual to intense to downright beautiful with how it handles its themes and character development. It helps that Honkai Impact 3rd has far less characters than most gacha games, so the story can focus on all of them and thus makes it easier to feel attached to them. This game gut-punched me in the feels way more than I would have ever expected from any game on mobile devices, which is something Genshin just hasn't lived up to yet, at least for me. At the end of the day, it's still a gacha game, so there's still some bullshit RNG you have to deal with when it comes to pulling for characters and weapons that will actually do damage in the end game, but I recommend not stressing the grind too much and just enjoy the ride. It's worth it for the peak waifus alone. In my mind, 2022 will always mark the year in which my brain really started to rot. Because of this little series called the Trails series, The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky is the first chapter of this massive multi-arc saga that I'm nowhere near caught up with at the time of making this, but it floored me. This particular entry is not any higher because it's really a game that takes its time to sink in, but I think that time for crucial story development is ultimately why it does such a great job setting up the tone and stakes for the coming games in the series. The writing is very down to earth and relaxed a lot of the time, but something that doesn't fully hit you until the end is just how much is actually being set up behind all of the dialogue and character interactions. The gameplay, by and large the battle system, is easy to digest but has a bunch of little nuances and mechanics that make it enjoyable to experiment with characters and builds. I love using the time element because you can almost indefinitely delay the enemy's turn. I think every turn-based RPG could use this. Even the difficulty is pretty well tuned in my opinion, where you're still free to be flexible with your setups, but can still get stomped by some of the tougher enemies. Even still, this entire game has a sort of relaxing aura with how much you're incentivized to complete side quests and interact with NPCs, without ever feeling like pointless filler, with how much extra context they can provide for each of the memorable locations you visit. And it hits all the harder when a bombshell drops and the plot suddenly escalates, knowing the people you are protecting firsthand and what's on the line. While jarring tonal shifts like this could really crush a lesser game, Trails in the Sky does an incredible job with its writing to not only make this feel natural, but also a great driving force for character growth. Nowhere else does all this build-up come full force than during the ending of the game, which is one of the very few endings in anything to leave me legitimately speechless. Trails in the Sky is far from the only JRPG with excellent characters and development, but it's genuinely one of the best executed and some of the most engaging stuff I have ever come across, which makes it more than worth checking out if you have the patience for a long story. I've played a decent amount of Metroidvanias in my life. Hell, my favorite game is a Metroidvania, so it only felt natural to finally get around to the granddaddy of the genre. Super Metroid is nowhere near as flashy as other Metroidvanias that would come out, with stylized visuals and more advanced gameplay mechanics, but damn if it doesn't hold up extremely well. Super Metroid is just one of those games that's so well designed and intuitive to play that you almost have to stop and notice how subtly the game points you in the right direction through the insanely clever environment design, in which I am the first person to actually point this out. All the levels are as distinct and alien as I'd expect out of the series playing the Prime trilogy prior to this, and that's literally it with my experience with the series, and are really sold on how well the game integrates an understated yet atmospherically fitting soundtrack into each of them. Very few games capture the deep sea, scary anglerfish hell aesthetic quite like Meridia, and maybe we should be glad more devs don't have this power. It also never feels like a game that suffers from too much backtracking. Progression is very loose, so you can easily spend a lot of time exploring a single area for upgrades, and won't need to return until much later when you've already gotten so many other upgrades that the old content feels like a new experience. Super Metroid is truly excellent in all regards. The only thing I would say isn't top tier is the combat. It's a bit basic, but features interesting enough boss encounters to keep things fresh. Either way, it's impressive how much they got right this early on, and it's no wonder it's seen as such a hallmark in game design. As a longtime Kirby aficionado who has played at least 90% of the games in this series, I can safely say that Kirby in the Forgotten Land is my second favorite Kirby game, only behind Return to Dreamland. For the longest time, Kirby has always just been begging to be in 3D for how often the game's played with dynamic camera angles and doing everything a 3D game would do, except allowing you to actually move in the Z-axis. With this innovation so long withheld from the series, it just makes Forgotten Land feel much more special than a typical Kirby entry. Kirby's gameplay translates so cleanly in 3D that it never feels like the game needs to take baby steps to get you used to a new dimension we've already experienced in games for the last 30 years. Standard enemies are pretty pathetic like they are in literally every Kirby game, but the boss fights really explore the opportunities posed by the extra dimension by throwing in all new creative attacks complemented with all new creative ways to dodge those attacks. Positioning is way more crucial here than in previous Kirby games, which is refreshing to see when before you could just abuse some copyability stupid iframes and scrape out of most fights just fine. Similarly, level designs also take advantage of the 3D space by offering a level of detail and exploration just not possible in a game restricted to the 2D axis, on top of being all around just fun and very well paced as usual for the series. The whole post-apocalyptic setting was also a neat theme that further set it apart from every other Kirby adventure, on top of every other innovation for the series. The only thing that was a bit neutered were the copyability move pools, which had some supplementary attacks from the 2D games removed, though this blow was softened a bit by the upgrade system, which functionally adds to some of your moves throughout the course of the game. Either way, Kirby in the Forgotten Land is a genuinely fantastic game that you owe yourself to play if you've even remotely enjoyed a Kirby game.
Shit, he did a car too? That's awesome.
I know Earthbound-inspired RPGs with extra quirky dialogue and themes of depression are certainly not hard to come by thanks to indie gaming scene in current year, but even fitting all of the description to a T and funny memes telling me that I should be more skeptical towards it, I stand by the fact that OMORI is a beautiful experience. I've been debating with myself for quite a while on whether I'd still consider this a masterpiece. The gameplay really isn't anything to write home about, and is really just standard JRPG click attack, caveman do big damage, and then some rock paper scissors thrown in to decide if you do slightly more damage or slightly less damage. If you couldn't tell, I was actually describing Pocket Mortys. This is a game that really lives and dies by the story and the connection you feel towards its characters, and judging by its placement on this list, it worked pretty well for me in that regard. This is one of those games that just consumed my thoughts over the time in between my play sessions, as it does an amazing job using vague, disturbing imagery to invest you in finding out the deeper mysteries hidden from you by your very subconscious. It's easy to write off OMORI when the indie game market is so oversaturated with narratives akin to this one, at least when describing it on a surface level, but it's really the way that OMORI handles its endearing characters and presents their struggles that make the emotional moments hit in a way that very few other games do. An admittedly simple RPG that grabs you by the heart from the very beginning and twists the story into something powerful. And then there's the soundtrack. Damn, that shit banging. If there's one thing I didn't expect out of this year, it was playing John Woo's The Grudge, and for it to be this good. F.E.A.R is a masterclass among FPS games that somehow incorporates horror elements and makes them effective, all the while you could slow down time and roundhouse kick some psychic dude's clones. Fight scenes are like something straight out of the Matrix with how badass the bullet time effects look, and how much crazy shit you can do when everything around you slows to a crawl. You may think that's OP, and it is, but you're still a one-man killing machine up against an entire army of intelligent AI, so you're still in for a decent challenge on higher difficulties. The way the AI units interact among themselves and work out tactics to overwhelm you is incredibly impressive to this day, and runs circles around so many modern games that it's almost not even funny. Almost. I also like what they did with the health packs, where you can hold quite a few of them on your body for reserved healing, and almost allows you to play carelessly the more you can expend. It's a really cool dynamic that allows you to take more risks than you may normally, and combined with the bullet time slowdown, really discourages constantly hiding behind cover unless you really get wasteful. The fights are only half the experience, however, as F.E.A.R also gives the player moments to soak in the atmosphere and maybe see some spooky shit out of the corner of their eye. The way the game constantly keeps the player on their toes, either through intense firefights or tense quiet moments depending on the entity taking center stage, makes F.E.A.R so strongly deliver a blend of vastly different sensations that I've seen very few games pull off so well. Elden Ring. Wow, that's very new opinion. Original, never seen it coming. You are watching a top 10 video. Search elsewhere for that shit. Open world video games certainly come and go, with some sticking around longer than others, and can be messy due to their sheer scope, but they're popular for a reason and just hit differently when they nail it. Open world Dark Souls is all I need to hear to determine that, yeah, maybe 95% of video games don't deserve a chance.
What the Come on.
Like many of its open world brethren, there's a lot of room for improvement. Obviously, assets are copied and pasted to make the world as big as they desired. Some of the recycled duo boss fights are Dark Souls 2 boss levels of poorly designed and ganky. There's this really cool sword with a special status that drains the fun out of the game you paid money for, and the balance is kind of just all over the place. That said, the amount of fun I've had pouring 100 plus hours in my initial playthrough, and my willingness to do it again with different characters and builds, should speak volumes for how much they knocked it out of the park. The variety on display here is insane, not only through the boss encounters and locations you end up in, but with your own build capabilities. Just about anything you want can work if you use the tools at your disposal, and though you can experiment with a lot using a single character and feel satisfied by the end of it, there's still a lot of new stuff to try out if you're one for replaying Souls games. Why am I going through the game using two little lightsabers that barely hit 2 feet in front of me? That's pretty dumb, actually. I should probably reconsider that. General combat is practically identical to that of Dark Souls, but I hardly see this as an issue when I find it to be one of the most engrossing melee combat systems out there. The boss fights, barring the shitty duos and repeats, are amazing, and really rival some of the best from Dark Souls 3 with some killer boss themes. You fight a Malekith, you fight a Margit, you fight a Radahn, you fight a Godric, and also his soldier. The major bosses are so distinct in both their designs and movesets, and will really push your dodge rolling skills to their limit. Even the main dungeons were badass, and really brought home that little extra bit of Dark Souls experience in its level design that we would have been missing otherwise. In both spectacle and gameplay, Elden Ring is an amazing package, and I'm sure I'll be playing it for years to come, like with the other FromSoft greats. How do you follow up what amounts to nearly 40 hours of exposition? By telling one of the best goddamn stories I've ever witnessed. Trails in the Sky's second chapter is not unlike the first chapter, in that it's relatively slow-paced at times as there's still so much exposition that continues to be set up, but the weight of everything you know by now, including the bombshell ending of the previous game, allows this chapter to shine like the sun when it comes to its story. Almost everything has seen a substantial improvement, from having more options in battle, more challenging encounters, new locations, but the most rewarding part is diving deeper into the characters you grew to know and love throughout the course of the first game. The stakes are so much higher, not only because there's a more serious threat this time around, but because the characters mature through some incredible arcs and are revealed to be way more than they initially seem. This might be my favorite cast of characters in any video game, and that is not a statement I make lightly. Estelle Bright is the bestest, most based girl of all time, whose rashness makes way for an endless, burning determination that makes her a true force to be reckoned with. Joshua Estray is a lot more calm and analytical in contrast to Estelle, but has been consumed by his past to where he must find answers for himself, trying his very best to protect the girl whose smile gave him solace in life. Kevin is a level 400 billion schmegma male. Every single character is interesting and has something to say, and even when the pace slows down, it's not long before you're hit with a crazy revelation that shakes up your perception of everything when it finally clicks. Even with a strong start, the story only gets better as the game progresses, which leads to an entire final sequence that is just is perfect. As I've said before, I'm not even close to being caught up with the Trails series, but if Trails in the Sky second chapter is any indication on the kind of beautiful stories that can be told through such a memorable cast of characters, then I can say that Falcom has created something truly special. So that's gonna be it for my ranking. Feel free to let me know your favorite games you played this year. Maybe I'll make this a somewhat reoccurring series where I talk about games I recommend without going into extreme depth for a full video. I don't know, let me know if you'd like to see more. Either way, thanks for watching, I've got more stuff coming, and I'll see you in the next video.